And thanks for joining today's installment of our webinar series. I'm Jeff Kupfer, the president of ConservAmerica. For those of you who don't know, ConservAmerica is a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing and promoting market-based solutions to our energy, environmental, and conservation challenges. We've been around as an organization since the mid-90s, but have recently reinvigorated ourselves to help drive policy debates towards more meaningful, impactful solutions. Towards that end, we've been working on several fronts, including a webinar series intended to provide information on these challenges and the opportunities in the energy, environment, and conservation space. And so in today's installment of that series, I'm really pleased to be joined today by Roger Ballentine. Roger's the president of Green Strategies, Inc. Previously, Roger was a senior member of the White House staff, where he served President Bill Clinton as chairman of the White House Climate Change Task Force and as deputy assistant to the president for environmental initiatives. And prior to that, Roger was a special assistant to the president for legislative affairs, so he certainly knows those issues in those areas as well. And before that, he was a partner at the law firm of Patton Boggs. Roger will be helping us discuss the potential Biden administration if Vice President Biden wins the upcoming presidential election and what we can expect in that situation, and also what the platform for Vice President Biden has been during the campaign and some of the issues. So with that all said, let's just jump into it. First question I want to ask you, Roger, is at his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, the Vice President identified climate as one of the 4 existential crises facing the country. Based on Joe Biden's history, where the Democratic Party is today, were you surprised that he used that framing and how he characterized the challenge of climate change?
Well, Jeff, thank you, and thank you. Thanks to ConservAmerica and EarthX for the opportunity to talk to you all. I really appreciate it, and welcome the opportunity to talk about these subjects at this time. So it's a great opportunity, and I'll say up front, I don't speak for the Biden campaign. I'm just someone who's kind of been in this climate ecosystem and around policy issues for longer than I care to recount. So was I surprised by his framing as climate change as a top 4 existential threat? I was not, for a couple of different reasons. One, I happen to believe it's true, and that isn't always the main explanation for how things get articulated in political campaigns, but I think in this case the critical nature of the climate challenge we face is in fact an existential threat, and therefore having the nominee of the Democratic Party articulated that way does not surprise me. The other reason is, and this is a good thing, back when I was first working on these issues in the government back in the late 90s, climate change was a dirty word, and it wasn't just with Republicans. There's a lot of Democrats too. I literally got thrown out of several Democratic offices on Capitol Hill during that time because I wanted to talk about climate change. And in the intervening, decades, the issue has migrated up and up and up the political priority chain to now, shocking myself of 20 years ago, it is in fact a top 2 or 3 issue on the Democratic platform and the Democratic Party on a fairly broad basis. So. No, I wasn't surprised, and I agreed with it.
Okay, and so along those lines, and as you mentioned, it sort of has wide acceptance within the Democratic Party as a key issue. The vice president's plan for tackling climate and dealing with environmental issues is comprehensive. If one looks on the campaign website, I mean, there's pages and pages that are devoted to it. So just trying to boil it down for people who don't necessarily follow, you know, every part of that discussion. I mean, how would you summarize the overall goals of the plan, and what are the key policy components of that plan that you think are most meaningful?
Well, that's a really difficult question, Jeff. As you know, climate itself is such a complex issue, and that is the phenomenon of climate change itself. And then the translation into kind of the socioeconomic, political system of the various ways in which climate change both impacts and how various mitigation pathways, how that would affect different parts of the political economy, you know, means that a climate policy is actually a set of many policies. So it's not a single thing. If I had to boil down, you know, kind of what is that essence? You know, at the highest level, what's at essence is I don't want to say everything we do, but a very, very broad swath of what the government does when it comes to policy proposal and policy implementation has climate-related impacts and implications. So at the highest level, I think what Biden is saying is that we're going to integrate climate considerations into a broader set of how we look at the various things that the federal government can do, policies that are being administered, and policies that can be proposed. It's kind of incorporating climate into that. Now, you know, a step more specifically. So what does that mean? And I agree with you, there's a lot in the Biden climate platform, but there's a lot that's left unsaid as well. And I think that's because it's, you know, it's not like all the decisions have been made about how to proceed on this. And there's a lot of factors with regard to that. But take for example, you know, something that is fairly concrete in terms of articulating a goal. And one of the ways that the Biden campaign is approaching the climate issue is to speak in terms of outcomes and end goals. And those are by and large driven by the climate science, which I think is smart. For example, he's articulated a goal of having a decarbonized, you know, net zero electricity sector by 2035. You know, is there a comprehensive set of policies on exactly how it's going to be accomplished? Not entirely. There's some, like a clean energy standard, which would be kind of a supply side top-down mandate on what the mix of generation technology should be on a carbon-free basis, and that certainly is a component of that end goal. But by articulating, you know, whether it's mid-century net zero economy, which is what the science tells us we need to get to, or decarbonized grid by 2035, which is aggressive, but all the science tells us that the outcome we need to reach is a decarbonized grid well before mid-century, because we're then going to use that decarbonized grid to drive remaining carbon out of other sectors like industrial and transportation that are going to be harder to decarbonize on that same time frame. So that's a perfect example of a Biden policy kind of following the science and articulating we know the results we need to get to meet this decline in emissions that science tells us we need to stabilize the climate, and then work back from those first principles and timelines to come up with the components. And for the electric grid, that's one example. A clean energy standard is part of that. And there's other pieces of that as well, but it's outcome-based, science-based. That's how I first and primarily describe it.
And so when you think about it from that standpoint of a goals-based or outcome-based approach, there's obviously a whole variety of different tools that one could use to get there. And as we've seen, certain tools like working through a regulatory structure are arguably easier for an administration to do, but they run the risk of being reversed in a subsequent administration. Whereas legislation, depending on the makeup of Congress, arguably harder to get to, but probably more durable going forward. And so as you think about, you know, where a Biden administration would try to put more of its efforts, do you see that the regulatory approach is a place where, just based on past history and everything else, you think that they'll take more of a, you know, that they'll be more robust, or is there pro, or are they going to shoot for more legislative solutions, something along those lines?
Yeah, I think the answer is all the above. There's some immediate regulatory measures that I think the administration will take. Some will be reversals of Trump regulatory decisions, and that speaks to your point, which is regulatory decisions tend to come and go depending on who the president is. So we'll have that back and forth. We'll have that to and fro and reversal of some things on an administrative basis right away, and I think that's fine. But Joe Biden, himself, I mean, he's a creature of the Congress. He's a legislator, and he's a deal maker, a real deal maker. And I think his strong inclination will be to seek legislative breakthroughs on climate and energy. He will absolutely want those to be bipartisan. And so I think you'll see kind of simultaneous movement there. It'll be a little different, I think, than in the Obama-Biden administration, where there was the comprehensive legislative attempt early, a Waxman-Markey, which I think in prioritization and aspiration was great. I think tactically there were a lot of mistakes made there, and I suspect those mistakes have been learned, and you'll see a different approach to legislating. But then when that failed, and after the midterm elections, Obama was really faced with no choice, and embarked on a very aggressive regulatory agenda, because I think there was no other way to do it at that time. Putting aside who's to blame for that, that was just the reality. I think at least going in, there will be some optimism that in a new Congress, and of course this will depend in part on the result of the congressional elections as well, but there'll be an optimism that there can be a legislative path forward that can be bipartisan to some extent, and I hope considerably bipartisan, but you'll see both.
Okay. And so, speaking of bipartisan or trying to get as much buy-in as possible, we've seen the vice president try to draw a line between his proposals and the Green New Deal. Yeah. And he said that the Green New Deal is a, quote, crucial framework, but he hasn't endorsed the specifics of the Green New Deal. And we've seen it continuing to come up at various presidential and the vice presidential debates. So what is it from your standpoint, and obviously you don't speak on behalf of the campaign, but what does it actually mean to say that it's a crucial framework? And do you think that he's been successful in trying to walk this line between not necessarily alienating the people who support the Green New Deal, but also trying to set out his own path?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to the second part of the question is, we don't know yet. Part of that will be determined by what happens on Election Day. I'll tell you how I interpret that. I interpret that as him saying what the Green New Deal represents is a statement of priorities that puts climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy at the absolute top tier of policy objectives for the administration. And again, I think that is true, and I think that is appropriate. So to the extent that the Green New Deal expresses that prioritization of the issue, you could say it reflects that framework. The other thing that the Green New Deal does is not just elevate it to a top tier issue, but apply a very aggressive timeline and time frame to the pace of change needed. And again, I think that by and large is, again, appropriate. And that's just a question of climate science, which it is what it is. And so I interpreted that as saying, I align with the Green New Deal in the extent that I do think it's a high priority, and I think we need to move fast. So that's where I would kind of full stop on that statement, which is fine. In terms of the Green New Deal itself and him distancing himself from, he has to an extent, and I don't know I can't speak to the details of that, but I know there are some who are fervent climate advocates, and I consider myself one of those, who felt that the Green New Deal maybe decreases its viability by emphasizing more of the New Deal than just the green part. So I that could be part of it. But having a climate policy laser focused on the climate aspect of it, which of course climate policy is energy policy, it's economic policy, it's social policy. You can't separate all those things. It is part of all those things. But again, framed by the science, and I think about how we think about climate action is it's need to be guided by the science, and it's going to be enabled by the politics. And how much the politics will enable what science says we need. I mean, that's the ultimate question, and that's where a lot of persuasion is going to have to be done, and some bipartisan outreach is going to have to be done, particularly if it's going to be durable legislative solutions. And some of the solutions to climate that we need are going to have to be legislative solutions. But again, I think there's a shared sense of urgency, a shared sense of how important this is between what Biden's saying and the Green New Deal. And I think he has done that. And the other thing he's done, and this was in one of the recent debates, he framed this the way I've been waiting for a presidential candidate to frame this for quite a while, and that is, there's a moral issue. What's happening to the climate is, kind of setting the table for what, our kids and future generations are going to have to deal with. And it's a moral responsibility, in his view and in mine, to take action to try to preserve the natural and economic prosperity that we have enjoyed, and that is in fact threatened in many ways by the phenomenon of climate change. And the trick is, how do we create a more sustainable, low carbon economy and hand on a planet that's livable and prosperous? And that is a moral calling. And I was really happy to hear him say that. And I hope that stays part of the message, because I think it, again, has the benefit of being powerful and true.
Roger, we've both served in government roles, and so we're familiar with the push and pull in government about trying to please different advocacy groups on either end of a particular issue. So as one thinks about the Green New Deal, there's a school of thought that suggests that once, if Biden does become president, that he'll be pulled to adopt different pieces of the Green New Deal in a more fulsome way than even he's said that he would during the campaign. So as you look at what's happened in the campaign thus far, his comments and kind of the back and forth that's occurred, how do you sort of handicap that for people who think that's a significant issue for them?
Well, I know, as President Trump would frame it, is that Joe Biden's beholden to the radical left. It's not the guy's nature, first of all. Second of all, if he is able, as he has, to state clearly that it's the Biden plan, not the Green New Deal, you're running against me, not Bernie Sanders. If he can say that during the campaign, when arguably that's the hardest time for him to say it, I'm confident that he will continue to chart his own path as president. Having said that, I mean, that doesn't mean that every plank and proposal associated with the Green New Deal is something that he's going to resist. I don't think that's right. Again, I think it's going to be guided by what does the science say we need to do, and what is the most aggressive yet realistic political pathway to get it done. And then through that formula, yeah, I mean, so back to the example of a decarbonized grid by 2035. Is that radical? It's very aggressive. Probably to the point that almost it's a bit of a long shot, but again, guided by the science. And does the science say 2035? Some of it does. That's kind of when we need to get there. Others, maybe in the 2040 time frame. So I wouldn't get too caught up on 2035 versus 2040. The question is, how do we get on a path to do that? Do we have the technology? The answer to that is yes, in my view. Can we do that in a way that is not going to hinder economic growth? Absolutely, in my view. There's going to be a lot of salesmanship that goes along with that. Again, going through that prism of what is it that we need to do and what is it that's doable. And doable, and I think the former vice president would agree with this. Jeff, you've been in this town for a long time. A snapshot of what is politically doable on any given day is not necessarily the snapshot of what that political bandwidth could be in the future, and that's also not a entirely that pace of change of the politics is not imposed upon the administration and the president. The president and the administration, one of their obligations is to shape that and to create that political will and to influence it. In the case of climate change, accelerate acceptance. And I think Joe Biden's pretty well situated to do that.
Another place, Roger, besides the Green New Deal, where the vice president has tried to walk a line, it seems, has to do with oil and gas development. And he's called explicitly in his platform for a ban on new leasing of oil and gas on federal lands. But he's been continually attacked by President Trump and others as proposing to ban fracking. And he did open himself up at one of the early Democratic debates by making some comments that could be interpreted in that way. He's tried to be clearer in some of the other debates since then. But from your standpoint, could you explain exactly where he is on oil and gas development, especially in light of a comment at the most recent debate about the oil industry sort of transitioning away? And do you think overall he's done a good job of articulating that position?
Let me start on the last point. Frame precisely is a good job of articulating it. I think we saw in the last debate the answer to that's probably not really. I mean, the articulation part hasn't come off right. Is his policy position right? I think it's dead on. So let's look at what he said and where this comes from. I see he has said repeatedly in clarifying statements and otherwise he's not talking about banning fracking. He may ban it on federal lands, just as he may limit leases on federal lands for new oil and gas development. That doesn't trouble me. If you look at the vast majority of where our production is done in the United States, and the production in significant part because of the innovation is fracking that has led us, and this was during the Obama administration, to being a net importer to becoming a net exporter, which is a phenomenal development for those of us who grew up back from the oil embargo to the early days. And I don't think Joe Biden has any intention of rolling that back. So if we never go on to federal lands with new oil and gas development, we're still going to be an exporter. We're still going to have plenty of, we're still going to be the world's leading producer combined of oil and gas. So that sounds dramatic. It's actually not. It's a relative drop in the bucket. Now, if your business is developing on those lands, yes, you're going to be impacted by that. But from a geopolitical, energy balance standpoint in the United States, it's really not that big a deal. So I'm fine with his position there. On fracking, I think you're more likely to see more like the way the Obama administration approached it, which is fracking can be done very, very poorly and recklessly with a lot of collateral damage, or it can be done much more responsibly. And I think bringing up the bottom, because when you're talking about fracking, or whether you're talking about, other big climate related issue in the oil and gas sector is upstream methane emissions, that the major producers, they were all fine with what the Obama administration proposed for methane capture regulation that Trump repealed. And so you'll go back to that. And again, that the majors don't think that's going to interfere with their ability to produce the oil and gas that we need. The larger point he was making, and again, driven by the science, we're going to have to decarbonize on a rapid basis. Ultimately, does that mean we're going to have to stop using oil and we're going to have to stop using gas? Well, the issue is the carbon emissions. Okay, so if there's a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of natural gas, that should be the first place we start. There's no question that fracking has enabled a lot of cheap gas, which in turn has been this, the single strongest death blow to coal in the United States. It wasn't Obama regulations, it was hydraulic fracturing and cheap natural gas that killed coal. If you go out to the 2035 framework timeline around decarbonized grid, what does that mean? It means we also can't still be having a lot of uncontrolled natural gas powered electricity. So does that mean we stop using gas? In a significant part, that probably will happen, and the market will come up with alternatives. But we also are, and I'm confident of this, we're going to deploy zero emission natural gas generation technology. And I think you'll see the Biden administration strongly supporting that. So natural gas was a bridge fuel. You've heard that, but it also could become a peer if we don't figure out how to deal with the carbon emissions at the end of it. So I think he was speaking to the science tells us that we're going to have to drive these emissions out of the entire energy sector over a matter of time. There's many ways you do that. And I think that's what he was getting at when he said we're going to phase out oil and gas. We're going to phase out the emissions. And it's a multifaceted way that's going to happen. Electric vehicles and the growth of electric vehicles, improvement in energy efficiency and tightening of efficiency standards, and on and on and on, are all going to contribute to that evolution. And by the way, last thing I'll say on this, there's a lot of major oil companies, and I would say close to probably a majority of Western oil and gas majors who are saying really the same thing. Timeline may be a little bit different, but they're saying that we're going to need to phase out uncontrolled fossil fuels and move to cleaner energy sources. And it's not seen as radical when the companies say it. Biden was really kind of saying the same thing, which I certainly don't think is radical.
And so you made the point about a relatively small percentage of oil and gas production happening on federal lands, which is accurate, and that therefore a ban on new leasing on federal lands may not have the largest impact geopolitically or on the U.S. energy sector. And so, at least from the Biden standpoint, do you think? I mean, what was the motivator for proposing something like that? Is it more of a messaging issue, or is it more of a sort of, hey, let's start here with something that we can control and then move, further down the chain?
I think my guess is it's all that in significant part. But there's also a long-standing concern among many, not just Democrats, but mostly Democrats, that the way we have auctioned and leased drilling and extraction rights on federal lands has not been a particularly good deal for the taxpayer. That it's actually been part of the other thing that Biden mentioned in the recent debate, or tried to clarify. He's really talking about phasing out subsidies. The way we lease and provide access to our federal lands is in fact a subsidy. And there's been kind of longstanding discomfort with that's really not the appropriate way to use taxpayer resources in value, to provide subsidy to these companies. So I think there's that element underneath it as well. But yes, it's messaging, and yes, it's an issue that's become very, very political, and it doesn't surprise me that he's taken that that position. And my view is I think it's a fine position to take, because I don't think it has any major disruptive impact on the U.S. energy sector writ large. I think there will end up being conservation values other conservation values associated with that, regard to habitat and water that are beneficial, and probably outweigh those values. Probably outweigh the marginal net loss to overall energy productivity in the United States. So there's lots of reasons I assume they did it, but again, I think they ended at a pretty good place.
Sure. Yeah, you've served in the White House. You've seen these issues from inside and outside of government. There's been some discussion about whether Vice President Biden, if elected, whether he would propose to have a climate czar or somebody to oversee some of these issues, or that government should be restructured in a particular way. How do you sort of look at that whole suite of issues? Is the government organized in the right way to deal with where we are nowadays in terms of addressing these issues? Should it be changed?
Yeah, well, okay, so I've lived this. Now, having said that, I was in charge of climate change at a time when it was seen as not a top priority, but if any, by most people, even Democrats, seen as a real kind of a political loser, which made my job challenging. How you structure. Look, I think the only way it's really going to work is if the climate czar is the president of the United States. So you're going to need very clear, strong presidential leadership and expectations on the issue, which I think you will see. Getting more into the weeds. The challenge is, and I lived this, where my jurisdiction for the climate office was kind of carved, a little bit carved out from the National Economic Council, a little bit carved out from the Council on Environmental Quality, a little bit carved out from the National Security Council. And, you worked in a White House, it's a fairly turfy place. And that can make things very, very difficult, but climate is a cross-cutting issue. The Secretary of State's going to have a major role. The Secretary of Energy is going to have a major role. The EPA Administrator, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, USDA, on and on and on. Which is why ultimately the czar needs to be the president of the United States on a day-to-day basis. I think it makes sense to have a climate czar. That person needs to be an assistant to the president. And for those who aren't familiar with how the White House works, there's the senior staff in the White House is divided into 3 tiers. There's assistants to the president, deputy assistants to the president. That's the senior staff. Then there's special assistants to the president and everybody else. I think the climate person needs to be in that top tier. They need to be an assistant. They need to have that peer relationship with the National Security Advisor and with the head of the NEC, the National Economic Council, and so forth. So yes, I think that would be a good idea, but even that person only succeeds if the president really empowers them to succeed.
Okay. All right. So moving on from sort of the inside,
that's real
baseball,
that's real
Washington
baseball.
Issues, which
no,
which, I mean they're important because they're important.
People should wake back up.
Or not getting things done. But one of the things that's been in the news a lot is the Paris Climate Agreement, and everyone knows President Trump has indicated that he was going to pull the U.S. out of it. Vice President Biden has said that he would put the U.S. back into it. Is that big a deal from your standpoint? Are there some legitimate criticisms of the Paris Agreement that could or should have been addressed? How do you sort of see that just from an international side of things? How important is it?
So it is, to me, it's a no-brainer to rejoin, and for a couple of reasons. One, just the damage to, let me state it positively, the reparation of the relationship to the United States and many other countries in the world that would be gained simply by rejoining makes it worth doing. Secondly, for an issue that, other than for this current administration perhaps, but for many other countries in the world and a growing portion of the population, is in fact a top tier issue. It just kind of signals that it is not by pulling out of that. And so we go back into it. If you look at, and I'll come back to criticisms because there's plenty of criticisms of it, but if you look at, again, the kind of timelines and outcome-based elements of the Biden climate policy, it's based on the science. Paris is based on the science. So we're committing to try to do it anyways. So why not get the geopolitical benefit of rejoining and assuming a seat back at the table with the international community? Whether we join it or not, it doesn't really change what we need to do as a country to meet our own climate objectives, whether it's labeled meeting Paris or something else. It doesn't really matter to me. And even, maybe politically, you don't need to frame it as we have to comply with Paris. We have to do what we need to do to pass on a sustainable future to our children. And by the way, we think that this low carbon transition is going to be an overall economic stimulus, which I happen to believe it is. So you don't have to say you're doing it because of Paris, but we are going to do it. We're going to make that attempt. And if we're going to be making that kind of attempt, we might as well rejoin and get the benefits of that. Now, are there criticisms of it? Sure. Sure, you can come up with criticisms. But what Paris did is, again, I don't want to get too wonky here on the history of international climate negotiations, but, Paris fixed kind of the biggest flaw of previous agreements in the Kyoto, or at least the Kyoto Protocol, which kind of did, in fact, can give a pass to developing countries, most prominently China. Paris didn't do that. Everybody was in it. So the biggest complaint against the predecessor agreement was fixed by Paris, and I think that alone was a tremendous accomplishment. Are there transparency issues? Could you pick at whether there's really enough teeth in it to ensure that a China or somebody doesn't cheat or doesn't misrepresent what they're doing? Yeah, of course. There's always going to be that. But again, we're not doing it because we signed Paris. We're doing it because we think it's the right thing to do for a whole host of reasons. And if we're going to do it anyways, let's get back to the table and assume a leadership position, because if we leave our seat empty, someone else is going to sit in it. And that's probably not going to be in the best interest of the United States.
Roger, speaking of China, they put out a statement in the last week or so criticizing the U.S. for our approach to climate. So how do you, what do you make of that? And how and if there is a Biden administration, where does climate fit into the U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah, well, I think the Chinese just found that to be just an irresistible opportunity to take a shot at the United States. So I'm sure they had some fun with that one. Look, we can't solve this problem without China. We can't solve this problem without the United States. China and the United States probably can't solve it alone themselves, but boy, they could do a lot. So I think it's critical, and this goes back to, I think the first real productive discussions around climate change between the United States and China actually occurred during the Bush administration. Secretary Paulson was very, very strong on this point. And then Obama picked up on that and had a very aggressive outreach to China, and I think you'll see Biden do that again. Is China a perfect and reliable partner in the fight against climate change? No, I don't think they are. I'm not sure they are for any issue. But not engaging is probably the worst outcome of all. The Chinese have a very mixed record on climate. And they point out that we do as well, which is fair. But Chinese, yes, they've made some aggressive commitments. They've deployed a hell of a lot of renewable energy, but at the same time, they are continuing to use an enormous amount of coal and expand their coal fleet, and there's contradictions out there without a doubt. But climate is a global phenomenon, so we all bear the consequences of what everyone else does. So seeking a cooperation and collaboration, whether it's technology or otherwise, which brings in a whole host of other U.S.-China issues that go beyond climate. But if the issue is, are we better off, kind of engaging again or not? I said we're certainly better off engaging again.
Okay. Roger, you've been really generous with your time. And so before we bring things to a close, I just want to ask you a final question, or
Yeah, sure.
sort of set of questions, which we speak a lot about climate. I mean, we've done that even in our discussion here, but there's sometimes climate sort of overwhelms the other environmental or conservation issues that are really important as well. And maybe even more important in sort of day-to-day life for a lot of Americans right now. So are there a few kind of non-climate environmental or conservation policies that you would point to in the Vice President's plan? I'd mentioned there were some notable advances in Congress in the last few months, even things like the Great American Outdoors Act, which was passed and then signed by the president. Other Republicans we've seen have begun proposing different initiatives, even the Trillion Trees Act, which is up at a debate, or the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which talks about nature-based solutions. So how do you sort of see some of both Vice President Biden's proposals that exist in these other areas, and how do you think he would or should build on some of these other initiatives that have either passed or been discussed?
Well, look, I got involved in environmental issues, primarily from that conservation-related aspect of the environment, and conservation, natural resource protection, habitat, biodiversity, providing access and opportunity for hunters and fishermen. None of that is unrelated to climate change, but you also don't need to talk about it as a climate issue. And I think there's, it is certainly one of the better openings, I think, for bipartisan cooperation around the environment. So I suspect you'll see, whether it's really driven out of the Department of Interior or USDA, for example, a pretty strong push under the Biden administration to pursue more traditional conservation issues. The Great Outdoors Act was fantastic. In fact, I worked on, the earliest iteration of that, or one of the earliest iterations of that back in the 90s. And it took this long to kind of get a lot of that done, but there's more to be done. So I certainly expect and certainly hope that conservation issues, clean water, land protection, biodiversity, habitat, where I think there's very strong consensus on a bipartisan basis that more can be done there. There's bipartisan infrastructure. There's groups like yours that across the aisle that we can work on, and it's going to take both openness from the kind of traditional environmental community to be open and cooperative with the broader bipartisan array of stakeholders who actually really care about these issues as well. And again, I think just Joe Biden instinctually, he can sense where there's a deal. He can sense where there's common ground. And I think this will be one area where you'll see a Biden administration really try to do some important things around conservation and other environmental issues that aren't necessarily labeled climate in neon lights. And I certainly hope that is the case, but I do expect it to be the case.
Okay, well, thanks, Roger. That's a good way to bring this to a close. I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone for helping us to understand Vice President Biden's platform and where things may go if the election goes in that direction. So thanks for that. Once again, Roger's the president of Green Strategies, Inc., and provides consulting services. And based on this conversation, we can see why his clients find it very rewarding to engage with him. So thanks again, Roger. We really appreciate it. We look forward to being in touch.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everything that you do, and look forward to being in touch, and we'll see what happens in a few weeks. And if the vice president is not elected, then you can just delete this because it's no longer relevant, but we will see. So look forward to being in touch. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Roger. Okay.